The Albigensian Crusade is a protracted, convoluted, and frankly confusing affair, to me at least, which is why today it is my pleasure to bring you the first returning guest on the Just Feudal Things podcast, Professor of History at Berry College, Laurence Marvin, to tell us about the Albigensian Crusade, and especially how it relates to his book, The Occitan War. This is the 13th episode of Just Feudal Things. The last episode was something of a deep dive on the First Crusade with Dr. James Noss, and the next episode will be about Harold Godwinson, so you can look forward to that. If you'd like to follow along, the hub for all things of the Memory Medieval Project and the Just Feudal Things podcast is on Substack. You'll find the link to that below. And if you'd like to support my work, you can sign up for a paid subscription there, which helps me out quite a bit. And thank you very much to everybody that has signed up so far. I'm going to include something for all of my paid supporters where you'll be able to ask questions of the podcast guests and get some questions in, and we'll kind of add that as a little special feature moving forward for paid subscribers. Unrelated, but I also must mention, I have a collaboration video coming out in the next couple days with, in my opinion, the best history channel on YouTube about the Italian Normans, which I wrote the script for. You'll be able to find information on that at my Substack as well as on my X account. The links to those will be in the description of this podcast. And so today's episode on the Albigensian Crusade is featuring Laurence Marvin, who's taught at Berry College in Northwest Georgia for the past 27 years as a professor of history. He was most recently on the 5th episode of this podcast, where we discussed his 2024 book, The Damietta Crusade, and talked about the military history of that, as well as some medieval military insurgency. He also has an earlier book, The Occitan War, which was published in 2008, which is what we're going to discuss today, which is a military history of the Albigensian Crusade. You'll be able to find the link to this book in the description below. In addition to his books, he's written a number of articles, book chapters, encyclopedia articles for journals such as the Journal of Military History and the Journal of Medieval History. All right, so let's start at the very beginning. It's called the Albigensian Crusade, but it involves the Cathars. Why is it called the Albigensian Crusade, and who are the Cathars?
Well, let's see. It's called the Albigensian Crusade because sometimes it's associated with the city of Albi in southern France. And so that's a very simple answer to it, but that's why it sometimes gets that name. I mean, as far as why it's called that now, I mean, it's just a convenient name, sort of like Fifth Crusade or Third Crusade. The Cathars were a group in southern France, and that's where there's actually a lot of controversy. There didn't seem to be as much, well, there wasn't as much controversy, let's say 20 years ago, but now there's actually more controversy. The standard classic description of Cathars is that they were a group that eventually believed that there were two gods. So this is how I would explain it to my students, is that there was a god of light and there was a god of darkness. Everything spiritual, including the human soul, was in the province of the God of light. Everything that was evil, but also material, including the body that soul was in, was part of the God of darkness. So you have these two gods, they were co-equal. In conventional Christianity, of course, you have the God and you have the devil, but we always know who's going to win, right? So in Catharism, these gods were more co-equal. And the problem is that human beings themselves were souls. In other words, their souls belonged to the god of light, but they were trapped in a body that belonged to all corporeal things and also what inhabited the earth. So it's kind of an interesting religion because it's not one we typically hear about, but there are other issues with it, and that is that how did that soul reunite with the God of light when it's trapped in this bodily vessel? So it can get pretty complicated, just like any religion theologically gets pretty complicated, but that would be the simplest way. What's become controversial for historians is that classically it used to be seen as maybe coming from an older time or another place. And historians in the 21st century began to argue that maybe it was homegrown. Another big argument that kind of turned everything on its head was whether Catharism really existed in this, was it really a religion or was it kind of local practice? So it's pretty interesting from the historian's point of view how we have sort of argued, particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, about what the nature of it was, its origins and all that.
So I'm very much a layman approaching this subject. And so just from the brief reading that I've done on it, it seems to suggest that this grew out of the Catholicism of the time. But when I hear about it, it doesn't sound like Christianity or Catholicism. Like, how do I wrap my head around that? Is it Christianity, or are these people Christians? Did they consider themselves Christians? Like, how do I wrap my head around that?
Well, the fact is, historians don't really agree on that. I think that it was probably an amalgamation of things. It is kind of Christian in the way that you have this God of light and this God of darkness, and sometimes the God of darkness is supposed to be Lucifer. So there are definitely some Christian overtones. And I guess what I would say, maybe as the relative expert here, is that one of the things that I'm very careful about saying these days is I don't really talk about a Catholic Church until you get to the Reformation. Yes, traditionally you have Catholicism going back to Christ or Paul, but Catholicism is really a brand, and you really couldn't have it until you had an alternative. Sort of like Coke and Pepsi. As long as there was just Coke, then there's just Coke. So I usually talk about the church prior to the 16th century as the Latin Christian church, because of course there's an Eastern Christian church too, or an Orthodox church. So I guess I would say is it an offshoot of the Latin Christian church? It could be if it was local practice. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be. I mean, there was a movement in the 4th century called Manichaeism, where there was also a god of light and a god of darkness. And so for a long time, historians thought that this was just a kind of reappearance of that old heresy. Now we're not quite so sure. And also, too, there's a group called the Bogomils from Eastern Europe that also had some aspects of this. There's also Zoroastrianism, which also has two gods, so sometimes called Persian dualism. So these kind of things are not new. The question is whether this thing that began to make an appearance really in the 12th century was one of those things, or was something that just locals came up with, or, as some people have argued, the Latin Christian Church created. In other words, they knew something was wrong and they connected dots, and next thing you know, it becomes a conspiracy theory. So some people have argued that as well. So it's pretty interesting, pretty fertile, but there's no absolute knowledge of what this stuff was.
Did the Cathars consider themselves Christians?
I think that sometimes they did, and then sometimes they didn't. And there was also there was a big difference between the leaders and the followers. So the followers could live a normal life, and it was only the people that devoted themselves. So in that sense, it's kind of weird because it does kind of mimic Latin Christianity at the time. So in other words, if you're a monk, you took monastic vows, or if you were a formal member of the church, like a priest or a bishop, but regular people just lived regular lives. And it was actually the same for the Cathars. So I suspect that if you were to ask one, if one could ask one, they might say they were Christian, and yet they might actually also believe in this other thing. I think that it's possible for human beings generally to have more than one belief going on in their head at the same time, even if the beliefs are kind of dissonant with each other. And I think it would have been the same for them too.
That's pretty interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about the conspiracy? What's the deal with that the church created?
Well,
It?
I mean, I think that, as I say, some good scholars have worked on this, and it's just that they would hear this stuff, that, oh, there's these two gods and these people there are turning away from the church. And it wasn't like a conscious conspiracy, but after a while, and let's say you talk to somebody or you heard somebody espousing this, well, next thing you know, and then you hear it from another town, like you hear some people in one town, southern France, let's say, were doing this, and then you hear people in another town were doing it. Well, then next thing you know, it becomes a conspiracy. They're all connected. Oh, and there's bishops too. Not only are there clergy of this religion, but there are also bishops, and they actually have meetings. Well, that may or may not be true, um, but that's the sort of connection of dots that turns into a conspiracy awfully easily and awfully quickly. So as I say, there are some very good historians that have argued that this really was not a thing at all. This is something that a paranoid Latin Christian church created. And there's some merit, I suppose. It's hard to say. You can go your own route. You can believe that. On the other hand, you can think there maybe was something that was different, or maybe that it was just localized. I mean, people didn't have the internet. They didn't have any mass communications, and so um, you know, you can create your own stuff pretty easily when you're localized, when you're not getting outside ideas. It's kind of funny because nowadays we think people create conspiracies because they hear all these outside ideas, but it can happen equally easily when you don't have any outside ideas. So yeah, it's interesting. It's bizarre from our standpoint, but also to some degree unknowable. Because after all, the sources that we have more or less come from, if you want to call it that, the winners, right? I mean, so they were hostage to what they could find out. And of course, as I say, they found out these things mostly through fear, and also people confessing that, who were fearing the consequences, and so therefore our picture may be very skewed.
So, and this is obviously this conspiracy angle is entirely new for me. The first
Okay.
thing that comes to mind when I hear about something like that is, once they show up with the crusading army, wouldn't there be some sort of like, hey, this was just a misunderstanding, like actually, we're not doing that, or this is not how it is, or if assuming we're saying that the Latin Christian Church made this up, or sort of coalesced these evidences into something. Once the army shows up, wouldn't they just say, whoa, it's
Well,
been a misunderstanding?
the crusade was precipitated by the murder of a papal legate. So, a legate, of course, was a pope's representative, and this papal legate was murdered in the South, and that was kind of the final straw, which made Innocent II, the pope at the time, actually preach the crusade. So, what's interesting is that the Cathars show up in records, at least from the mid 12th century, so 50, 60 years before. And there had been some attempt at preaching to them. And there was there's this kind of mini expedition in the 1180s to maybe deal with them, but nothing really came of it. But it really was precipitated by the murder of this papal legate. And then one of the things that people don't often understand is that the crusade itself was actually preached against Raymond VI, who was the Count of Toulouse, who actually was a regular old Latin Christian. It wasn't really preached against individuals per se. Now, the crusade ended up not attacking the Count of Toulouse's lands. That's part of the kind of intricacies of the crusade itself. But so, as I say, it was an act of violence that actually precipitated the preaching against the Cathars in the first place. But it had been building for a long time. It had been building for decades.
So I guess maybe that would be a good place to, maybe you can give us sort of a general overview, a little bit of a walkthrough of that, then, of sort of a short history of the Albigensian Crusade, and then we can kind of get into a few things there about what exactly is going on with the political situation. So you're saying that it was originally preached against Count Raymond, but then it didn't attack him and sort of went off.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I mean, so Raymond, in a sense, intercepted the crusade. So the people gathered and they began to make their way to southern France, thousands and thousands of people. and he managed to intercept them. And of course, the Count of Toulouse was a major noble. He had relatives in the Crusade army, and he managed to convince them that he was a fine, upstanding Christian. And sure, I don't have any reason to think that he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't particularly pious, but a lot of them weren't pious. But he managed to convince them that where all the Cathars were in his nephew's lands. So that was Raymond Roger Truncaval, sort of the next territory over. And so in a sense, Raymond made his peace with the crusade. He said, okay, whatever you think I'm guilty of, I'm willing to do penance for it. And so he was actually reconciled to the church. And so then all of a sudden you had these guys, thousands of people whose main target now has been taken away from them. And then he presented them with, gee, why don't you go against this guy? And so they wanted to do something. And so it was pretty easy. Plus Raymond Roger Truncaval wouldn't reconcile himself to the church. Again, he was an Orthodox Latin Christian, but he felt, and this I think I would have agreed with him, is that he felt like this was just unfair, and he wasn't going to. And so they wanted them turn over Cathars, and then do these humiliating ceremonies, then you'll be good. And he didn't want to do it, and so that's when the warfare really started. And then of course, as I say, it went on from there. I mean, it got very complicated, as any kind of war does, and the original goals and objectives. I mean, the original goal, get rid of this religion. Well, how do you do it? The way I liken it to is it's sort of like Americans in Vietnam. The VC didn't walk around with a neon sign above their head and say, "Hey, I'm Viet Cong, so go ahead and kill me." So people would go into Vietnamese villages and just assume they were all guilty of it. Well, that's the same with the crusade. Is you go down there and you assume that people are guilty, because if they're not a Cathar, then they're harboring Cathars, or they're protecting them. So and then this went on for a long time, a couple of decades really. So, but as I say, it kind of changed its spots. It became, I'll probably get some argument here about, I wouldn't quite say a political land grab, but a quasi-political land grab very quickly, because again, you didn't know who a Cathar was. And so how do you keep this land firmly Latin Christian? Well, you have to have somebody to do it. And so then you had somebody do it, but you have to offer them some incentives. That was Simon de Montfort. And eventually the goals kind of shift. In other words, he was just trying to control things, and the local nobles didn't want to be controlled, rightfully so. And that, as I say, caused this terrible war that lasted a couple of decades.
When I was just briefly reading about it, it seems notable to mention that this part of, like, it can be easy, I'm American. It could be easy to think of France like this is a crusade of France against France. But this part of France at the time was very like the Toulouse area. It's very different. From my brief reading, they were saying it was really more closer to Spain than it was
Right.
in terms of France. So these people were very different. So that analogy sort of Vietnam actually makes a lot of sense in that way.
Even today, you could look at any Western European country and still see how regionalized they actually are. So, in other words, I'll give you an easy one, and Americans will understand this. I mean, look at the British Isles. In the British Isles, you have England, but you also have Wales, and Wales is a Gaelic or Celtic culture. You have Scotland, and you have Ireland, or at least now Northern Ireland, and now that's England. Um, if you look at France, even today, Americans don't appreciate how regionalized France is today. France, in a weird way, is kind of schizophrenic in a way that it's very centralized, and yet it's still very regionalized. And that part of southern France kind of reminds me of the American South. And since I live here, I've had a long time to observe it. But they spoke a different language, and it was closer to Catalan. So the classic way to that people describe the difference is that northern France, or France north of southern France, was the langue d'oui, or that language where they said oui for yes, right? Because of course, if you learn French, you say oui. Well, in Occitan, you said yes, it was oc. So then you get the Languedoc. So so they spoke a different language. They had slightly different histories. Um, that part of France, or maybe I should call it Francia rather than France, was technically kind of ruled by the king of the Franks, but for all intents and purposes, it was kind of an independent entity. But that would have been true for other parts of Francia or France at the same time too, like Brittany, for example. There's a different language there too, Gascony. So that this land was very, very heavily regionalized to the point that somebody from the north couldn't be understood by someone in the south and vice versa. That still remains today, by the way. I mean, it's when I try to use my rudimentary French in southern France, I mean, nobody understood me. So, of course, I could say that for northern France too, but especially seemed difficult to be understood in the south. So,
Yeah, I think that's definitely something as an American that we don't appreciate, sort of those dialects and how things are so different, because for the most
yeah.
part, you can go anywhere in America and understand other Americans, and it's pretty straightforward.
Right. We are an incredibly unre- unregionalized country, despite the fact that we like to think that there's Texas barbecue and there's Georgia barbecue, but yeah, the differences are actually a lot less than they are in almost anywhere else in the world, including Western Europe.
Okay, so it's even though it's technically a crusade against France, it's kind of its own independent entity, I guess is maybe a better
Yeah,
way to think about it.
yeah. I mean, and it was also partially because of the incentive to do it was different. Because for crusading, ultimately, crusaders did it because you had your sins forgiven. I mean, sometimes called the indulgence, but how you got it is you actually went on the journey, and it changed over time. But the idea was that you were supposed to get to the Holy Land. Although, again, as I said, that changed in southern France, which is or the Albigensian Crusade. One of the things that's so notorious about it is that in order to get the indulgence, a crusader just had to be in the South serving with a crusade force for 40 days. And then they just pack up and leave. I mean, there was no set obligation beyond that. And so, I mean, one of the things that I actually wrote an article about was this period of the 40 days, because then again, I can use the analogy of Vietnam. In Vietnam, guys began to, sort of become short timers and count down the number of days they were going to be there. And, it didn't matter whether people were still dying at the end of your year, your 13 months, then you went home. And it was kind of the same way in the Albigensian Crusade. People would go down there and they'd be in the middle of a siege, but they'd done their 40 days and then they would just pack up and leave. So as I say, the incentive to get it was a little different too.
And so, how does this go on for decades? Maybe you could talk a little bit about like the timing of this, because that doesn't really compute for me.
Well, I think it went on for decades because what it really sort of became was not only getting rid of this religion, but whether they were going to impose kind of northerners on these southerners. Because again, Simon de Montfort, in order to incentivize him to prosecute this crusade, he was given the lands of Raymond Roger Truncaval. So he became the Viscount of Beziers, Albi Beziers, and Carcassonne. And uh, there were other nobles down there that didn't particularly care for it. And Simon he was a very ambitious guy, and he began to intrude on other territories, again, including the Count of Toulouse. And, all the nobles down there, they stood to lose everything. They'd be replaced by northerners. And so they fought back. And on the other hand, one of the things I've argued is that 40-day period meant that, again, in the middle of a campaign, people would just pack up and leave. So there might be like several thousand, and all of a sudden, okay, we did our 40 days, we're going to leave. Well, how do you prosecute a war that way? Well, it's not very easy to do. And so, plus two, of course, there's the inherent limitations of operating in the winter, right? I mean, we live in a world in which we would expect if the U.S. were involved in a conflict, or even any modern state, that they could operate during the winter time. Well, I mean, that's a very modern thing. In the 13th century or in the third century, you couldn't operate 7 days a week, 365. I mean, and when it was wintertime, you had to sort of pack up and go into winter quarters. And so campaigns in the Albigensian Crusade, just like they'd be anywhere else, they only lasted really for the summer until the weather deteriorated. And as it was, Simon did try to prosecute conflict into cold weather and snowy weather, and he usually got bit for doing it. And he usually had a setback. And so, as I say, you have this war that's fought for less than 6 months over the year, and so it kind of just drags on. And then you're constantly trying to get people down there. You constantly have to worry about people leaving. It amounted to sort of some guerrilla warfare down there too against his troops. So in other words, it wasn't like there were all these battles all the time. In fact, there were very few battles, but a lot of, I guess, what you'd call quasi-guerrilla activity, a lot of sieges and that sort of thing. And of course, sieges took forever to do. And so it's no surprise really that it lasted as long as it did. It sort of took a different turn when Simon was killed. He was killed at one of the sieges of Toulouse, and his son took over. And at least from my reading of the evidence, his son really was a lot less interested in prosecuting it the way Simon was, and a different guy. And he just didn't have the kind of fire in the belly that his father had. And so he began to try to get out of it. He wanted to just pack up and go home. And so eventually he was able to, but it took a couple of years after that. So as I say, all in all, it lasted the better part of 2 decades. The sort of formal military aspects. There's some military activity even after the 1220s, but it wasn't sustained as it was up to that point.
So maybe you can walk us through then a little bit of that. It starts with the older Simon Montfort, and then it ends with the younger one. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, Amory Montfort was his son.
Oh,
so
Amory, okay.
the younger Simon of Montfort, if you know your English history, he became very famous in the 13th century in England, making a big play almost for the throne of England. Of course, he was killed too in battle, but he had a totally different life. He was the youngest child of the elder Simon, and he more or less became an adult in England. So very different life, although his end was similar. He died a violent death. But his older brother, Amory, he took over as the oldest son of his father. But as I say, it's pretty clear. I kind of like Amory. I mean, he had a good sense of humor. I think he was a decent guy. The old man, Simon, he was a pretty tough cookie. The younger one was a nicer guy, but on the other hand, too, he was a little softer, I think, and he had more trouble. And then, as I say, eventually just got sick of it and wanted to get out of it. And so, the French government eventually had more of a direct presence there, and that's why the King of France was interested in sort of bringing this in more directly under the crown. That took another generation or so, but so it was a messy thing, and it lasted. It really didn't officially end until about 1271, so some decades later, when it became a formal piece of the Kingdom of France.
So maybe can you walk us through like a quick timeline of like major events? I believe it was like 1208 is like the Papal legate who gets killed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then sort of what are some of like the major things that sort of, as it's going and then to the conclusion there?
So the first campaign occurred in the summer of 1209, and it's probably even now the most famous or most infamous because one of the first targets was the city of Beziers, Raymond Roger Truncaval city. And what's I think famous for medievalists or people who are just interested in atrocities is that most of the time, as you probably know just from your own reading and talking to historians, is that medieval sieges typically took a very long time. The advantage lay with the defender. Some people have argued that fortifications were a force multiplier of like 4 or 5 to 1, and they're probably right. And so a few people could hold out for a long time against a bunch of people surrounding them, and of course, all they had to do is wait them out in a siege, right? I mean, in other words, if you had stuff stockpiled, you're fine, but the army around you they've eaten their way through the local area. They can't bring, there's no train coming, and there's no canned food. So eventually they're going to starve them. They're going to starve out pretty well. Eventually, maybe not quickly, but eventually. And so, but Beziers was one of those rare times when there was not a long siege. People are still trying to explain exactly what happened, but the upshot would be that the army attacked more quickly than maybe the people in Beziers expected, and they managed to break their way into the city, and then kind of all hell broke loose. And there's been a lot of debate, and I've weighed in on this debate about how many people were killed or how great a slaughter it was, but it's generally acknowledged to be a pretty spectacular slaughter. Partly it was because it happened so quickly, right? In other words, there wasn't a 45 days or 3 months. It was immediately. So anyways, that kind of punctuated the beginning of the crusade. And so then you have, over the next couple of years, a bunch of sieges, 40 some odd sieges of just various towns that were holding out against the crusade. And again, some very spectacular atrocities that occurred too against Cathars. So sometimes a siege would happen, and the city would surrender, and the Cathars were given an opportunity to reconcile themselves to the church, and some would do that, many would not, and so the ones that would not then would be executed. So, but as I say, that lasted then for about 9 years, at least until Simon Montfort was killed. Dozens and dozens of sieges, just a couple of battles, not very many, and then he was killed, and then you have other sieges and all that. But really, by the 1220s, it was kind of starting to peter out militarily as Amaury was trying to get out of just having to prosecute it anymore.
So then, let me summarize this, and you can kind of correct or interject where I'm missing a beat here. So in 1209, that's really the first prosecution. One of the first big engagements is the siege of Beziers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Then there's sort of over the course of the next 9 years, there's a series of sieges, a couple battles.
Yeah.
After the end of that 9 years, Simon of Montfort dies.
Right.
And then his son sort of attempts to unwind things over the next few years, basically.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it took a couple of years, because in fact I've written an article on after Simon's death and Aimery, because there was another big massacre under Aimery, or if you prefer, the King of France's heir, Louis VIII, or a guy who became Louis VIII. So Marmont, that was a big disastrous siege and atrocity there too. And then it kind of peters out. Doesn't end, but it peters out until the late 1220s. Eventually Aimery was able to sign a peace or a peace treaty and get out of it. And then Raymond's son, Raymond the sixth son, Raymond the seventh, was able to hold on to some of his territories. But Raymond the seventh ended up marrying his daughter to one of the King of France's sons. And if they didn't have any children, then her territory went to the French crown. Well, as it turns out, in 1271, she and her husband did not have children, and so the territory went to the French crown. So that area of Languedoc sort of formally became part of the French crown in the 1270s. So the last big atrocity occurred in the 1240s at Montségur. So that's usually one of the more famous atrocities that occurred, and that happened in the 1240s. But that was long after sustained military activity was taking place down there.
So what happened at that one?
Again, it was a holdout of Cathars, and if you ever get a chance to go to southern France, Montségur is one of the most isolated. So that's the other thing too, is that one of the reasons these sieges took so long is so many of them were high up in the mountains. And of course, if you've ever traveled in the Rocky Mountains or in the United States, we have some pretty rugged country. Well, we fail to appreciate that other places have pretty rugged country too. And so in the south of France, there's all these fortresses still. They still exist, which is one of the real treats to go there. And they're pretty rugged. I mean, so to get an army up there and to sustain them and do a siege would not have been easy under the best of circumstances. And Montsegur is probably one of the, I mean, it's just spectacular. It's on the top of this, it's called a pog, or the pog, and it almost reminds me of, I mean, it's kind of weirdly semicircle, but it's right at the top of this kind of quasi mountain, and it's very steep around the sides of it, and so it was very difficult to besiege. But the forces that were involved at that point were able eventually to besiege it, and then of course the survivors were taken out and executed at the foot of the mountain. So, so as I say, the kind of the military atrocity part of it kind of begins at Beziers and then kind of ends at Montsegur in the 1240s. But honestly, the military activity was starting to peter out in the 1220s.
Is Beziers where that very famous quote is from, which I'm going to paraphrase here, and I'm not sure. From my reading of it, people are saying that it may be real or may not be real, but it's basically like kill them all and let God sort them out.
Yeah, yeah. You can't write about the Crusade and not try to deal with that. The Latin rendering where it's taken from is just slightly different, and off the top of my head, I don't even remember exactly what it, how it's, I would literally render it into English, but um, it's likely apocryphal. The guy who said that was the papal legate, replacement legate for the one that was murdered, and he doesn't come down with a very good reputation. And he was a fairly callous person, I think. But there's no real evidence to suggest that's what he said. And in fact, actually, when you look at Beziers, what happened is that it would not have happened had there been any real discipline involved. And that's just it. So Beziers is kind of a weird thing because it happened almost spontaneously. In other words, Beziers was not commanders directing troops, break your way in the city and kill everybody. Beziers was the army camps across the river, and there's some exchanges between people in the town and some of the riffraff in the army. And the riffraff in the army got mad, crossed the bridge real quickly, and went to the walls. Meanwhile, while this was happening, the leaders of the army were sitting in a tent, presumably, discussing strategy of what they were going to do. So, in other words, the riffraff, the rabot, the ribalds, they broke their way into the city before the leadership even knew what was going on. And so, with the leadership, the only thing they could do was to try and get up into the city, and actually, where their camp was versus the city, it would have been a bit of a climb, and try to enforce some order. So that's where the slaughter comes in. Is you have a bunch of guys set free in a city, and they did what they wanted until the leadership could actually instill order again. So the fact that the legate Arnaud Mori would have said that, he wouldn't have had a chance to, because this thing happened so spontaneously. And nobody really wanted that to happen. In other words, everybody in the army would have liked to have the Cathars punished. They weren't against punishing them, but they didn't want the city to be burnt up. And again, there's some argument about how destroyed the city was, but I mean, at least a good chunk of it was probably destroyed. Well, that's not good for anybody. It's not good for, obviously, the people who live there. Even if you don't care about the people, it's bad for the people who wanted to plunder it.
What happened to Raymond Truncaval?
Well, he died in his own jail. So the Beziers got destroyed, and one of his other big cities. So he controlled more or less three good-sized towns: Albi, where we get the Albigensian Crusade name from, Beziers, and Carcassonne. And Beziers fell, and the next city west, major city, well, there was one in between. Okay, but the next big city that he controlled was Carcassonne, and he went to help defend it, and the city was besieged. And again, unlike Beziers, the siege of Carcassonne was not a cakewalk. In other words, it turned into a real siege. And eventually, the people of Carcassonne were starving and they were running low on water, and so they had to negotiate terms. And Raymond Roger I think some more work needs to be done on exactly what he did, but more or less he decided to kind of place himself on the mercy of the Crusaders, and he was incarcerated, and then he died a few months later in his own jail. There's always debate, again, conspiracy theories about, oh, he was murdered in jail. He probably died of dysentery or something like that. I mean, Simon de Montfort would not have been unhappy that he died. On the other hand, he probably didn't engineer his death. He was a young guy in his 20s, but again, imagining 13th century incarceration, it's not much better in the 21st century, but in the 13th century. So yeah, he died in his own jail, and he had a very young son, and that was part of the problem, is that uh, we still have this crusade to prosecute. How do we get people to stay there? Because most people are not going to stay. And so you give the territory to somebody who is willing to stay, and that was Simon of Montfort. But Raymond Roger's son, grew up and lived during this era, and caused some problems in the 1240s. So, but yeah, he died, young man in his own jail.
Rough. Good on his son, though. His son raised a little noise, so good on him.
Yeah, yeah, good for him. I mean, he was fighting a really a lost cause by the time he was, but he felt like he'd been robbed of his birthright, and in fact, he had. So
yeah, it's good energy. I like that. I can appreciate that.
mhm.
So, and Simon of Montfort, did he die on the crusade?
Yeah, he died at the siege of Toulouse. So, well, I should say, the third siege of Toulouse during the Crusade, and he had decided. So Toulouse was a very large city. It was the largest city in the south, and still one of the largest cities in France today. And the people of Toulouse had always been a thorn in his side, and they hated him, and he hated them. Um, and he decided eventually he was just going to besiege the city and take it. But the city was so large he could never surround it. So in other words, in a proper siege, you surround it, you cut off all food and and reinforcement, and he couldn't do it with that. The city was too large, and his army was always too small. And I think that's sometimes I've suggested that he eventually kind of had what you might call battle fatigue. I mean, um, by the spring of 1218, he'd more or less been fighting down there for 9 years, and I think he was starting to get sloppy and a little bit impatient. And actually, I think that started to happen even before, but I think he just got very frustrated with the way things were going, and he got too close to the action, and he got hit by a stone, and his um, head was crushed, and he was killed immediately. So um, he was probably the most talented. Well, he was the commander in chief, so to speak, but he was also probably the most talented and most bellicose guy on the side. And when someone like that is gone, it was really kind of hard to replace him. Again, it eventually it fell to his son, but his son just wasn't the same kind of guy as his father.
Too small of an army, too big of a city seems like a
Yeah.
classic crusader problem.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, but Toulouse, it just uh, it just never worked. I mean, there has been a lot of sieges of Toulouse. There was one even before that in the 1150s when there were problems between the King of England at the time and the Count of Toulouse, and the King of England didn't have any greater luck. So um, in order to capture such a large target, you'd have to devote probably years of it and slowly choke it off. And in the case of Simon, there's just no way, given the resources that he had at any one time, that he could ever effectively do that. So, but again, I think that was just a symptom of him just becoming impatient and his thinking becoming clouded, is maybe because he was tired. I mean, he wasn't a young guy anymore, and he wanted to get in and get in fast, and just couldn't do it, and exposed himself once too often, and got killed for his trouble.
As I understand it, this is mostly a French crusade, right? Most of the crusaders are from France.
Yeah, most of them are from northern France. I mean, from different regions of northern France, but there were Germans on it. There were Austrians on it, so it did draw people from all over. Occasionally, people from England as well. So the majority of the Crusaders were, I guess, what you would call Frankish or French, but not all of them. So, I mean, people would come and they would bring a unit with them and they'd serve for 40 days and then they would leave.
And this went across the reign of several different French kings. What was sort of their different relationships with the Crusade?
Well, actually, as it turns out, it didn't really encompass too many reigns. So Philip II was the king of France when the Crusade was preached, and he remained, I mean, until his death, until 1223. And then his son, Louis VIII, became king. And Louis had actually, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, he personally crusaded in Occitania, technically 3 times. So he'd been down there a number of times. And he actually went down there when he was king, too. But he was only king for a couple of years and then he died. He died in his late 30s, probably a dysentery. And then his son, the infamous or the famous Louis IX or St. Louis, was too young really to do anything. And Louis IX, of course, was king of France for a really long time, till 1271. Well, till 1270. So about the time that Raymond VII's daughter and Louis's brother died, and that part of southern France went to the French crown. So not that many administrations, so to speak. And so, as I say, I guess again I would say that the biggest one occurred during the reign of Philip II. His relationship with the South was, I guess, sort of a target of opportunity. Initially, he didn't want any of his nobles to go down there, partly because he was still, having trouble with the King of England at the time. That's the thing, the more you study this, the more you realize how interconnected everything was. And so he was okay with some people going, but not a lot of people going. But by 1215, when it seemed to be going pretty well for the Crusaders, then he was willing to not necessarily take direct credit, but he was willing to be given homage for those territories. So again, he was seizing an opportunity. Louis VIII he's an interesting guy too. He was more hot-blooded and passionate maybe than his father was, and he'd actually crusaded down there, and he was more willing to sort of go there and try to impose his will, even though ultimately that cost him his life. Louis IX was less interested in what was going on down there, although he did have some pretty interesting, sort of beginnings of some infrastructure down there, royal infrastructure. But he was, of course, more interested. His life's work was crusades to the east.
So Louis VIII died on crusade in southern France.
Yeah, I mean, he went down there sort of ostensibly to crusade or to bring the city of Albion to heel. How much that actually has to do with the crusade is another story entirely. But on his way back up north, yeah, he probably got sick when he was at the siege, and then he died on the way back. So yeah, so I guess in a way the crusade cost his life. I mean, in fact, this is something I've been doing recently. He appears to be responsible for one of the giant atrocities of the crusade in 1219 at Marmont. So he was definitely more bloodthirsty than his dad. And of course, he was the same guy too. There was a brief time where the French tried to take over England, and Louis led the way, right, in 1217. So he was the guy that was all over the map, willing to fight all kinds of fights. So, but he died in his 30s.
And so, what's this other incident, Marmont?
Oh, so Marmont was. It's interesting because even most people ignore it, including me, up until recently. It happens after Simon de Montfort died, but Amory Montfort was trying to impose his will sort of in the western part of what he considered to be his, and he got to the city of Marmont, and they didn't want to surrender, and so he was besieging them. And meanwhile, Louis VIII, still Prince Louis, but eventually Louis VIII brought an army down there as well, and they were able to surround the city more or less. And again, this is where the controversy comes in. The people that were defending the city, or the leadership that was defending the city, agreed to surrender to Louis. And what's still not clear and arguable is what that meant for the people in the town. So in other words, a noble and a group of nobles decided, okay, we're going to throw ourselves, on the mercy of the prince. And then there was a conference about what to do. And of course, what's not clear is whether the city was surrendering or whether it was just these people that were surrendering. And at the conference, if what we have is accurate, they argued about what should we do with the people. Well, some people said we should kill them because they're all Cathars or Cathar sympathizers, and some people said, well, no, maybe they're not. And this is the other issue: is how spontaneous it was. I have a feeling in this case that it was not 100% spontaneous like Beziers was. At any rate, people made their way into the town. And they slaughtered as many people as they could, so maybe several thousand. But Louis didn't really do anything. So during the conference, when they were discussing what to do with people, I mean, Louis, even though he's kind of by rank the senior member there, he didn't really say anything. And then when he did say something, he said that he would go along with what the church wanted. Well, it just so happened that one of the more loudly voiced bishops there said, everybody should be killed. So he could have put his foot down, and he didn't. I mean, I've speculated on that, and I've recently argued that he had been excommunicated for what he did in England just a few years before, and he'd had to be reconciled to the church in a humiliating ceremony. And I think he was afraid of running afoul of the church and having to do it again, or maybe having things be worse. And so he just went along with the consensus, which was, okay, let's go ahead and slaughter everybody in the city. But to what degree it was spontaneous is kind of hard to know, other than the fact that he didn't seem to do anything. And it's hard to know because that's not what happened, but I suspect at any rate that had he put his foot down and said, no, absolutely not, people there should be spared or ransomed or something, that this massacre would not have taken place. So that was a pretty big one, but it doesn't get much press. It's not quite as spectacular as Beziers.
But that would have potentially ran Louis afoul with the church again, right? Going against the papal legate or whoever's the guy there.
It may have, and it might have cost him. And again, this is, I would say, speculation on my part, but nobody has made the connection between the fact that Louis had been excommunicated for invading England, and eventually he'd had to sort of crawl to the papal legate there. And the legate had prescribed this kind of humiliating ceremony. Okay, if you want to be reconciled to the church, then at first he said, you have to come here, stripped to the waist, presumably maybe to get a flogging or something. And Louis's guys came to the legate and said, please don't make him do this. This is so humiliating. And so he was able to go in plain clothes, but it was kind of still humiliating ceremony. So my speculation is that then just a few years later, you have this instance where he could run afoul of the church again if he goes against what seems to be the consensus, and he just decided to do nothing and let things take their course, which at that moment was, let's kill everybody. Plus, he wanted to go on to Toulouse. Yeah, and they did go on to Toulouse, and Toulouse was yet again besieged, and yet again the city was too big and there wasn't enough guys, and they were only there for the 40 days, and so that failed again. So really nothing was accomplished other than this terrible massacre. So
if Toulouse is so good at resisting sieges, why didn't everybody just build their own Toulouse?
Well, Rome wasn't built in a day either, right? I mean,
fair enough.
So it's any super large city of the day, it would be difficult to surround and to starve out. So I think in this case there was just never sufficient forces all that time, and sufficient forces that would be willing to winter over maybe and to be able to take it. So I think there are probably other instances elsewhere, but in order to do this, you'd have to be willing to devote maybe a couple of years, and even that, the siege of Toulouse, where Simon was killed, it lasted about 9 months. So it's pretty long for a siege.
And so we discussed this a little bit the previous time that we spoke about the Fifth Crusade and how the Fifth Crusade sort of started as one thing, and then they became very focused on the city, and maybe sort of motivations change over time, and
Right.
The sort of the crusade itself sort of morphs over time. And this seems like that sort of concept just on steroids, because you're sort of, there's no real clear, like, we're going to Jerusalem. You don't know who a Cathar is. You sort of have, obviously, this changing of leadership across time. You have, I guess, starting with Simon of Montfort, then you go to sort of his son. You've got Louis is sort of dipping his toe in there at different times.
Mm-hmm.
So this seems like an extremely convoluted thing, basically.
Well, I think this always happens in long conflicts, and I suspect that again, if we were to use Vietnam, since I've been bringing it in frequently here, what the U.S. started with and what it ended up being, 7 or 8 years later, really maybe two different things. I mean, it started as one thing and then ended up being something else. I think with the Albigensian Crusade, part of the problem was the mission in the first place. How do you get rid of Catharism? Well, how do you get rid of what people believe, right? And that's pretty hard to do with a military solution. And as again, I've argued in my book and other forums that Catharism was defeated, but it was defeated really by a number of different things. And the Crusade, all the Crusade did was put all the Cathars on notice. Hey, if you get caught, you may get fried. But that it kind of drove it underground. And so in some ways, they just became more, I don't want to say insidious, it's unfair to them, but they became more secretive because they had to be. But the crusade itself didn't destroy it. But how do you can't destroy a belief through military force. And so it took other things in combination with the crusade to finally get rid of it. I think that, most scholars say that the Catharism really didn't end until the 14th century. So in other words, there were still people that believed in it all the way up into the 14th century. So one of the things that I have to admit I don't deal a lot with, but they're very fertile ground, is that there were inquisitions starting in the 1240s about assessing people's belief. And, those are a real treasure trove of just what people were thinking. Now they're tainted sources in the sense that, you know, you have authorities bringing somebody and asking them what they believe. I mean, if I got hauled before a tribunal, I would tell people what they want to hear, probably. So it's often hard to know exactly, are they telling the truth? Are they gilding the lily? Are they suppressing things? Whatever. But the Inquisition was one of the things that ultimately helped ferret out what people believed. And then, of course, the beginnings of the Dominicans, right? So the order of preaching friars, that also helped. I mean, they worked as inquisitors eventually too. So it was really a number of things that helped defeat that religion. And I would say it's as much the Inquisition and the Dominicans that did. And I don't mean the Inquisition because they threatened people with their lives, because actually, even during the Crusade, if somebody was blamed for being a Cathar, if they wanted to, they could reconcile themselves to the church, and then they weren't going to be killed. It was if they refused, or if they reconciled and then they slid back. And that was the same actually later on with the Inquisition. So you could get off relatively lightly if you confessed or made up a confession. But if you backslid, then that was bad, and then that could lead to your demise.
Yeah, that was one of the things I had just read a couple months ago, this book on medieval Christianity, and it had a whole section on the Inquisition. And that's really the first time I've really been exposed to it. But we have sort of this cartoon idea
Yeah.
of the Inquisition where it's like, if you say something wrong, they just take you outside and burn you.
Yeah.
And there's, sort of a series of escalating penances and
Right.
opportunities and things like
Right.
that.
Yeah, so the famous one, of course, is Monty Python, and nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, and the Spanish Inquisition itself is the most famous, but that was a evolution of the Inquisition in southern France. So the Inquisition, as we come to know and love, or come to know and hate, really began in Occitania, and it was a direct result of, we need to find out what they believe and then try to deal with that. And so when you'd send like two inquisitors, so again, even today this is the case. There are some parts of southern France that they're very remote. I mean, they would remind you of a little hamlet in the Appalachians somewhere, in West Virginia or even in Georgia. And these guys would suddenly show up and they would bring everybody into the church, and they would ask them, okay, so what do you believe? How many gods are there? And they would try to figure out what they believed, and then, sort of go from there. But I think that they were smart enough to realize that, if you immediately set up, a burn pit and start burning people, well, everybody's going to disappear real fast, and you're probably only going to, get at most one or two of them. So, and there were also some inquisitions, held in Toulouse later on in the 1240s, where people essentially got subpoenaed and they had to appear, and then they would give their depositions about various things. And so, as I say, that is a treasure trove, particularly for those people who are really interested in medieval religious belief and medieval heresy, about what people actually thought. I mean, the reality is that um, when you live in a small, isolated community, you can have all kinds of weird beliefs, or all kinds of, let's say, unorthodox beliefs, because you're not exposed to this wider culture. So, um, but as I say, it was the Inquisition and the Dominicans in particular who kind of ended up being the institution of choice to lead it, that eventually, was able to get rid of Catharism.
So I guess technically the end of the crusade is in the 1270s, but Catharism goes on beyond that for, let's say, another century, roughly.
Yeah, so the Crusade really ended in the 1220s, and yet some military activity was going through the 1240s, and then by, the region fell to the French crown in 1271. But again, what people believed, that's an entirely different animal. So, again, if I think about in the 21st century, I'm amazed at what people are willing to believe. I mean, it's just crazy what they're willing to believe. And and they have access to reputable news sources, reputable sources, and yet they choose to listen to, or read these crazy things. So, imagine a world in which there was no such thing as a reputable news source, and you live in a small town, and your world is the borders of that small town, and occasionally, people drift in from elsewhere, or in that part of southern France, I mean, sheep herders bring their flocks through occasionally, and then you hear stuff. But I mean, it's colored. It's like the 10th person who's repeated, like a game of telephone, and you hear all kinds of stuff. But by the same token, you're just kind of living your life, and so you believe what your parents believed, and you're happy with that. And then all of a sudden, a crusade lands on your doorstep, or maybe more likely, nothing happens. So you continue to believe what you believed, and then eventually these two Dominicans show up, and they they make everybody go into the church and start talking about what they believe, and people believed all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, if you've ever served on a jury, sometimes they ask you questions, and even there, I'm just surprised what people reveal in the jury room, and then also too, when you get to the judge and they ask you questions, and I was like, really? I mean, am I living in the 21st century in the United States? So I have to give people in the 13th century some credit. They didn't have access to the kind of things that we do to be able to separate truth from fiction, and what's true and what's not true. Inquisitors were generally pretty well educated guys, and the more experienced ones, they sent them out in teams. They wouldn't go by themselves. So, the one could sort of check the other if they were being unproductive, I guess would be the right way to say it.
And so if people want to learn a little bit more about this, they can check out your book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you cover in the book exactly?
So, my book is really devoted to that first 9 years, because, again, I've argued, although, 15 years out, almost something like that, I might have done phrase things a little bit differently, but the book was getting long enough as it was, and it didn't need to be any longer. Um, so my book is really about that very, very militarily intense period of time from when the Crusade started until Simon of Montfort's death. Um, and there are other people that cover, most of the time, in fact, people have covered the Crusade in a kind of a longer lens view than I have. So mine's more detailed than most others. But the same year that, well, I should say about 6 or 9 months before my book came out, another book came out on the Albigensian Crusade by Mark Gregory Pegg, who's at Washington University in St. Louis. And Mark is has much more of an interest in religion and the Cathars, and so he'd be a true expert rather than me. And he produced this book on the Albigensian Crusade, slightly longer in chronology than mine is. And I think he would agree that what we produced, I mean, that's maybe one of the joys of history, are very different looks at the Crusade itself. So, but there are a lot of people, a lot of good people that write about Catharism and medieval religion and all that. My book is more, I was really interested in the Crusade as a military campaign, because that's the thing. A lot of people had talked about Cathars and religion and all that, but nobody had bothered to just say, what actually happened during all these during this time. They talk about the Crusade and this terrible war, but they don't really say much about it. And so I wanted to actually talk about the war and these all these sieges and the battles that did happen, and how it progressed from there.
So, what do you think is like a defining or interesting characteristic of it then that you would say for people who are listening about it? Maybe is it that 40-day indulgence period, or what militarily do you feel like really stands out?
So one of the things that people have gone back and forth on is if the war was more intense in its treatment of surrendered people than in other places. And so one of the things that I've argued for is that marginally speaking, maybe it was, but in actuality, you can look at lots of sieges in Western Europe, and if people didn't surrender, I mean, so the standard thing is if people didn't surrender in a siege and people broke their way in, then everybody's life was potentially forfeit. Certainly the men, but even the women and children might lose their lives, and also they lost everything. Their property was confiscated and all that. And so a lot of people have suggested that the Albigensian Crusade was particularly horrible, and I don't deny that it was horrible. It is terrible. And in some ways, it was sort of sustained horror, right? You had these dozens of sieges and all that. So in some ways, the campaign, if you want to call it that, over at least the 9 years really after, was very sustained in a way that you didn't see maybe in other parts of Western Europe. Beziers, again, is a special case. It was uniquely horrible, but it was uniquely horrible out of weird circumstances that the siege never really happened. I mean, it just went from an army getting there and then them taking the town. Um, and so I guess I would say is that the book, I think, is pretty good. I think at sort of going through, we know how it ended, right? But getting there is sometimes what we don't always know. And so I wanted to talk about how we got there, how we got to this point, and and also to just say, I mean, there were some spectacular sieges, some pretty ingenious solutions to getting around these very difficult places to besiege. Um, and also, too, it's pretty impressive, even if you don't like the guy. I don't like him. Simon de Montfort. I mean, he managed to sustain a campaign for 9 years with, uncertain reinforcement. I mean, at one point, and I didn't even mention this before, the Pope withdrew the indulgence because he was starting to plan for the Fifth Crusade, and he didn't want people to be drawn off on these other side bits, so to speak. And so he withdrew the indulgence. Well, I mean, if you're the general down there, all of a sudden your main source of recruitment no longer exists. And so, I mean, Simon was a very impressive tactical commander. He's a brave guy. He led from the front, which ultimately got him killed, but very aggressive. And it's pretty impressive that he was able to do what he could do. Now, it's impressive in the sense that, from our standpoints, it's a horrible thing, right? I mean, I'm not saying, yeah, he's my hero or anything. I mean, far from it. But it's also impressive that the people of the South eventually put up a pretty good defense against him. I mean, so in the end, one of the things that people have suggested, and I agree, is that things down there were not changed quite as much as sometimes is argued. So, for example, most of the nobles of the South, with some exceptions like Raymond Roger Truncaval, actually kept their lands. Right. So, in other words, it wasn't like this total dispossession, which occurred in places like Ireland and also in Wales. So in some ways, the disruptions in the South were maybe not as deep as they were in other parts of Western Europe. So, I mean, all those things are, worth considering. So it's a pretty interesting thing. If people ever decide to go to southern France, Carcassonne um, is a 19th century version of the 13th century castle, but it's pretty spectacular. It's, I think, one of the great tourist sites, probably one of the greatest tourist sites in southern France, maybe in all of France. Maybe it's in the top 10. Um, but what's really interesting are some of these smaller castles high in the mountains. I mean, you go up there and nothing has changed. It's like the 13th century up there. And you can really imagine. I mean, it's like they're not surrounded by houses. They're really in the middle of nowhere, it seems to be. And you really do get a sense of how difficult these sieges were. And so that's pretty neat too. But it's one of those things that you can only really figure out if you go there. But still, I mean, as I say, there these. It was pretty amazing that they were able to sustain warfare so long, particularly because the people there hated them. I mean, the Crusaders. I mean, they weren't going to give them any more help than they had to give, and so I mean, that's pretty hard to do. It took a while for the Southerners to kind of find their feet and to be able to fight back effectively, but eventually they did.
And that sort of leads into maybe the last question that I have for you, and then I'll leave you with the last word. Is how did the Pope feel about all this as time went on? Because obviously he calls to crusade in 1209. It sort of goes on these different ways and things are happening. What's sort of the Pope's attitude about that? Or, I mean, is there different popes or, sort of what's sort of the papal opinion as this is all unfolding?
So there was a change of popes, well, a number of different times. I mean, it was preached under Innocent III, and then he died in 1216, and then the next pope, Honorius III, the same pope that was around for the Fifth Crusade, was the pope. Um, I could be, stepping out on a very thin limb here. They were very similar in many ways. I mean, in their broad agendas, because Innocent really was always more interested in crusading to the I mean, to the Middle East than he was actually in the Albigensian Crusade. And of course, ultimately, Honorius was the same way. What I found with Innocent III, at least, is that he was always sympathetic to the last person who talked to him. So first of all, he never traveled there, right? So he was far off in Rome. And again, as we've been talking about earlier, he was sort of hostage to what people told him. He couldn't look at a satellite picture of what was going on down there. And so, somebody would come to him and say, "Oh yeah, it's really bad, and we need to do something." And then he'd say, "Okay, well, and he'd send out letters and say, "Oh, you need to recruit for this." And then somebody from the South would show up, like even Raymond VI, and say, "No, it's not really bad, and Simon's dispossessing me. He's treating me terribly. I'm reconciled to the church," and Innocent would be sympathetic to him. And so then all of a sudden he would send these letters of admonishment to Simon. Well, you shouldn't be doing this, and make sure you don't trample the innocent along with the guilty. And then another representative of the crusade would show up there and say, "Oh no, this is terrible," and so it would just keep on going. And so what's interesting is that uh, during the crusade, the Fourth Lateran Council occurred, and the Fourth Lateran is usually considered one of the most important ecumenical councils that took place really between Nicaea and the Council of Trent in the 16th century. And at Lateran IV, although the evidence is kind of iffy, during the Lateran Council, Raymond VII came to the council to talk to the Pope about being dispossessed. Right? In other words, saying that it's really not fair that I be dispossessed of my father's property, because by then Simon was operating against the Count of Toulouse for anything. I'm a good loyal son of the church, and I'm being treated badly. Well, Innocent listened. I mean, and Innocent didn't say, "Well, you should have been a better Christian," and blah blah blah. But Innocent was sympathetic to him, and he kind of sent him away with the idea of, "Well, I understand why you might fight for your property." Well, I mean, you give somebody mixed signals like that, what are they going to do? Well, Raymond VII leads a rebellion against Simon. So I think Innocent really he's sort of frustrating in the sense that it's like, come on, really? Can't you have a consistent policy? And he really couldn't have. And then, of course, as you say, and he did remove the indulgence for a time. Why? I mean, I do understand why, but that didn't help things. So he couldn't really know with any certainty what was really going on the ground, which, of course, as I say, a problem even for any chief executive or commander in chief today. They don't really know what's happening on the battlefield, so to speak. So, and Honorius was consumed much more with the Fifth Crusade. Problems with Frederick II, but also then the Fifth Crusade. And that was one of the other reasons why, too, that there has been some work done on, what the connection was between the Albigensian Crusade and the Fifth Crusade. Did the Fifth Crusade draw off people who might have gone on the Albigensian Crusade, or vice versa? So the latest argument is that it probably didn't, but it's interesting that there are lots of guys that end up being on the Albigensian Crusade, but also showing up at the Fifth Crusade.
Just career crusaders.
I'm in the preliminary stages of talking about one of those guys. I'm not sure where it's going to go, but what I find amazing, and I just don't know enough at this point to have any real thesis, is that some of these nobles in the early 13th century, they were all over the place. I mean, they show up in Spain. They show up at the Albigensian Crusade. They're in England. They were at Bouvines in 1214, and they're on the Fifth Crusade. And I don't know why I should be surprised about this, but I just think, come on, you actually had to get on a horse or get on a ship, and yet they're willing to do that. And they'd spend a lot of their adult life for these various things. So it's not like one crusade; it's a bunch of different things. And so I find it interesting, and I want to know more about it and try to understand it, at least through maybe a few individuals. And that's what I'm kind of very early working on right now. But yeah, as I say, these guys, their names show up again and again in different places. So
yeah, that's one of the things that's really interesting, is starting to see these guys going all over the place and where they pop up. I was just reading about Harold Hardrada the other day, and he goes from Norway to Russia to Constantinople to Sicily, back to Norway, then to England. Dude's all over the place.
Yeah, and it wasn't very comfortable. I mean, people were used to living with the kind of discomfort that we couldn't imagine. But I still think, here I am in my nice air-conditioned office at home, and these guys would actually have to get on a horse or get on a ship, and there would always be an element of uncertainty. When we get on an airplane, we expect to actually get there. They couldn't really expect with 100% certainty that they were actually going to make their destination. So I have to admire their willingness to put themselves in such discomfort for months or years at a time, where we live in a world in which we just don't do that. I mean, even in the military, you deploy for a year, but you kind of pretty much know when you're going to be back, and sometimes things happen that extend that, but for the most part, you're going to be back. And these guys couldn't really know with any certainty when they'd be back or if they could get back.
Well, appreciate your time again. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for dropping the knowledge on us about the Albigensian Crusade. And I'll leave you with the last word. If you have anything else to say about Albigensian Crusade or medieval history, whatever you like.
Well, I'll try not to repeat what I said last time. I think the Albigensian Crusade really is interesting because it's an example of something that we thought we knew stuff up until the last 20 years. Sounds like a long time, but relatively speaking, historiographically, it's not very long at all. And there's still a relatively warm debate about those people who argue that Catharism, as I say, was homegrown, or what its roots were, or everything else. I do think that most people consider the Crusade as a unique example of sometimes genocidal violence, and I would say that it was very violent, and there were many atrocities and massacres, but I would not go so far as to call it genocidal, partially based on anachronism. Right? This idea of what genocide is, even though we can see it in other times and places, really, it is a kind of 21st century concept. I'm sorry, 20th century concept. And so the Albigensian Crusade was bad partially because it was sustained over many years compared to what you might see in other places, and yet in individual slices, it wasn't any necessarily worse than what you might find sieges in Scotland or Northern England at the same time, sieges in the Middle East during a crusade or anything like that. So, but there's plenty of people who disagree.